Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your guest host, John Wood, and I'm here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation and with regrets of Randy today. In this space each month, we have discussions featuring authors of publications and books that are reviewed in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, our journal. You're welcome to join us at 2 p.m. and the second Saturday each month as we have this discussion. It's our chance to get in depth with an author and to have a conversation about what we have read in this area of scholarship. Everything we have here today is recorded, so you'll be able to hear it in the future as well. So today we're beginning the coverage of the March issue of Perspectives. And we've got Dr. Erin Smith with us from California Baptist University. Welcome, Erin. Glad to have you with us. This is Erin's second time on Diving Deeper. He had a call for a second paper, and a very interesting one indeed. So most of you know a little bit about Erin from our first conversation, and if you didn't, you can find that recording on the ASA website. And you can get to know her, as Randy did an in-depth discussion of her background. But I know Erin's been doing a lot of work since in the late teens and the early 20s, and I know she's talking about some of that today. And so I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit, Erin, about what you're doing now and recently. I know you've got some grant applications in, some other interesting things in scholarship, so you can tell us about that. And then I'm going to ask you to go right into a conversation, a kind of summary of this very interesting paper, Neuroscience and Self in Interdisciplinary Dialogue. Erin?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me. So my research area is pretty much anything that has to do with scientific and religious cognition. Anything that is in that boundary, I try to put my hands in those various pots. And so I've done some research in Christian engagement with science. And then I've also, especially recently in the past couple of years, tried to actively build out my research, drawing from theological insight, working in the context of seminaries and with theologians to figure out where I can make bridges between psychological science and theological inquiry to help unpack and answer some of the questions that I find particularly interesting, dealing with who and what kinds of things we are. This paper that we're talking about today is a paper that was born out of my curiosity. So this would have been in probably 2020, I was invited to participate as a psychologist, a researcher, and kind of a sounding board in a group of theologians and philosophers who were working on a special issue around questions of self. As a result of that process, they really encouraged me. I would say it took a little bit of convincing, but they encouraged me to write my own contribution to that special issue in a journal called Science and Fetus on the kind of what can psychology contribute to conversations around personhood. In my process of writing that paper, I came across an article by a neuroscientist who argued that self, the title of the paper is something like self as the golden thread in binding. And so this argument was that rather than self being this kind of emergent construct out of our cognitive capacities, they were flipping the script and saying actually self is fundamental to kind of all of our other cognitive processes. And I didn't really understand that article, but it stuck with me. And part of why I didn't understand it is because I didn't have a bigger framework within which to nest that argument. So an opportunity came around. So my paper in the special issue was published in 2021. And near the end of that year, I had an opportunity to contribute a paper to a call out of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary as part of their They were running a conference on exploring personhood with the theme, "What is a person?" And so I decided to try to tackle a deeper understanding of that article on self as this binding thread, but specifically written for a theological audience. So what does the scientific research around that particular argument say, and how might it be useful for theologians and pastors trying to wrestle with that very question? This paper in front of us is ultimately a revised and expanded version of that paper I wrote for Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. One of the things I'm grateful for my anonymous peer reviewers who read essentially the draft that I submitted to the seminary and pointed out some really helpful places for expanding, especially expanding in kind of the scope of what the neuroscience literature says about the default mode network. But I wanted to share the history of how this paper came to be, in part because I'm uniquely proud of this paper as an effort of curiosity. As a professor, I often encourage my students to rediscover the curiosity that so unfortunately education seems to squander, and that we can look around the world and wonder and not know things and start to know and understand a little bit more. And so what you have in front of you is my efforts to learn and understand. What you have in front of you is not my massive expertise over all of the content area in this. That's just, I don't have that. But I do have kind of, I have an interest in trying to bring the various threads I brought in this paper together to enhance my understanding, but also hopefully contribute in tangible ways to the individuals in both theological circles and in psychological and scientific circles who are trying to leverage this kind of research for deeper understanding. So in this paper, go ahead. Yes.
Erin, this is just a great moment to give a shout out about what you've done and what ASA does. I mean, all of us at work can publish an ASA journal and do this work at the interface of multiple disciplines, especially in theology and philosophy coming in, and we're in social and natural sciences and going, I don't really know what I'm talking about here. And the brilliance, I think, of ASA, of perspectives, and the authors is that we get this chance to do this. Yes. And it's in an audience that's helpful and forgiving as the reviewers that you pointed to. So thanks for that summary. I just wanted to give that shout out, and to you and to the ASA and to our journal contributors and editor. Thanks.
Yeah, and I will affirm that. It was a wonderful experience thinking I'm allowed to be curious, but also that there is a place that I can contribute this curiosity to, where I hope that individuals who know a lot more about the items in a paper like this might have a new word and launch new ideas and inquiries that will go far beyond what I personally would be able to do. That's how, maybe it's a little idealistic, but that's how I hope curiosity can work in us as Christians, that we can feel safe and confident in our humble curiosity to wonder about these things. So in this paper, I really start by trying to sketch what do we know about how the brain works, and kind of a little bit into fMRI technology. Again, in every single point that I talk about, there are people who know magnitudes more than what I do. And so my goal here was just to sketch enough that we could think about the story of this paper. And one of the things that, as you think about kind of measuring the brain, one of the questions that researchers started asking a couple of decades ago is there a baseline? Because the brain is always active. And if these fMRI measurements are measuring brain activity, it's always in comparison to some other state of the brain. And so researchers started looking at really the control measurements in fMRI when folks lay in the machine still with their eyes shut, engaging in whatever their kind of normal internal thoughts are, this kind of mind-wandering, self-reflective kind of thought. And over the course of the past about 2 decades, maybe decade and a half, folks have started to say this is actually a consistent pattern of brain activation that we see across people. Now, again, there's arguments around whether this is a distinctive pattern, what we might call the default mode network. But I think a lot of people are on board with this being a network. How that network is interpreted is where there's a little bit more scientific debate. And so the argument that I bring in this paper is really out of Geoff Northoff's lab, where he argues that this default mode network is the fundamental kind of operation of the self, not self in a psychological way, not a self-conscious self, but this non-psychological kind of reference to my own brain, that my brain has a way of neurally encoding what is out there is relevant to me, and that ultimately produces the higher order kinds of outputs that we would then start to talk about self-awareness in a psychological sense. And what's interesting about this particular network and this argument is that if we want to think about the default mode network as being really important to kind of a precursor of a conscious self-awareness, we can look at ways in which the default mode network works well and when it goes awry, and what the consequences of a healthy or a less than healthy default mode network might be. And really where the paper ends is in thinking about 2 implications of this body of research and this particular theoretical interpretation of the default mode network. One of those has to do with how we interpret data, right? That the data don't speak for themselves. The data are interpreted through frameworks. And that's even true in the arguments around what the default mode network is. In fact, it's probably especially true in those arguments. And so I think that makes the interpretation of data around the default mode network particularly ripe for interdisciplinary conversations between neuroscientists and philosophers to ask, what do the data say? And what are the assumptions that we bring into that kind of interpretation? And what are the other possibilities? And then the second thing and this is really where my particular interests lie, have to do with what does or what might the default mode network tell us about human telos, human purpose, right? So when we look at when the default mode network goes awry, when does that happen? And what does that tell us about the kinds of activities that we as humans were made for because of the nature of brain and behavior linking there? So that's really the sketch of the paper, but I'm assuming that if you guys showed up on a Saturday, the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter, that you've probably read that. So I don't want to just repeat it all to you, but I would love to open it up for questions and really discussion amongst all of us here, knowing that each of you bring your own expertise and disciplinary ideas into this conversation.
Very good, Erin. Thank you. That's a great summary. And we're going to begin with the questions. I had one question that came in ahead of time, and I'm looking to see. I saw Del Kuhn was.
I'm here.
Del, very good, Del.
I'm here. My camera isn't, so I'm incognito. Okay.
That's quite all right.
Erin, go ahead.
Go ahead with your. Yeah.
Okay. Erin, I really appreciate your paper and the approach you're taking, because I think that the assumptions of philosophical naturalism are kind of under the radar for most people in the church. And I'm kind of hoping that you can expand a little bit on how psychologists generally approach the topic of purpose or telos, which kind of assumes a self, but let's just stay with purpose and telos.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Psychology and psychologists. So I was thinking through, because you submitted the question early, I received it yesterday, and I've been kind of thinking through this. And I think a little bit of a tangent into the history of psychology will be helpful. But don't worry, psychology is a really useful science, so it won't take that long. So psychology started kind of as its own thing, emerging out of this combination of the natural sciences and philosophy in the late 1800s. And you had folks like Wilhelm Wundt and William James, trying to understand how the mind is organized and what makes it work the way that it does. Mm-hmm. This really paved the way for someone like Sigmund Freud to come in the very late 1800s, early 1900s, extending these kind of what's happening inside our mind and how does it work into clinical applications, and talking about our unconscious and then all of these things that are outside of our awareness that make us do what we do. And if you are at all familiar with Sigmund Freud, you know that he had some pretty provocative things to say, and that caused a bit of an uprising in psychological communities who wanted to be taken seriously as a science, leveraging the naturalistic methods of science, of which Freud did not use, and had kind of all sorts of problems in how he framed his arguments. And so in reaction, at least in part to Freud, you have behaviorism take over psychology between about the 1920s and the 1940s and 50s. And so you have folks like John Watson and later B.F. Skinner, who are saying, if it's inside somebody's head, we're not going to talk about it. We are only going to observe behavior, the stimulus response, because we can talk about behavior. Whereas if it's inside your head, we're going to have to make inferences. And that's well and good. And we've learned a lot from behaviorism, and we still employ behaviorist techniques in some capacities in psychology. But it turns out that you can't actually understand a human person if you don't look underneath their behavior. That what goes on inside our heads is incredibly important to understanding why we do what we do. And so you have the cognitive revolution in kind of the 50s and 60s, where everything became about the mind. In the 1950s and 1960s, kind of setting the stage for this cognitive revolution is in many ways kind of the heyday of grand psychological theories. So you can start with Freud. He had a very grand theory, and then trying to come out of behaviorism, you have a lot of theories in psychology that are describing everything, right? And they want to explain all that humans are and do and think and whatnot. And it's in those grand theories that you have the intentional incorporation of something like a purpose, because you're going to chart from birth to death. These are the things that make humans tick. I think about Erik Erikson's theory. He's a personality and developmental psychologist, and he has a lifespan development theory where he basically says each phase of your life, you have particular crises, problems that you need to engage. And when you resolve them well, you develop virtue. And so he actually has built into his theory the idea that resolving these conflicts well make you a virtuous person. And if you don't resolve them well, you don't have virtue. And the purpose of your life is to develop this virtue. And so that's an example of a theory where there's a really intentional kind of integration of the purpose of human life. You are striving toward these particular virtues to develop. Since the time of Erikson and the cognitive revolution, we don't really have theories like that anymore. Psychology, rather than being a psychologist who kind of does all the things, we've broken into relatively siloed disciplines within psychology with micro theories. And so sometimes you might have a theory coming out of social psychology that's a lot like a theory coming out of cognitive psychology, but they're relatively independent. And so even it's hard to bridge across, even when you're within this broad domain of psychology. And in part as a reaction and a breaking apart of our theories, we don't address the question of telos anymore. So this is where we kind of come full circle to the question that you asked, Del, that we as a field, as a discipline, don't talk about purpose in life, at least not in any sense of I am going to kind of give you a description of what a good life or a bad life is. There are researchers who study purpose, but they study how is it that people develop their own sense of purpose in life? And that purpose can be wildly different. And so you could have two individuals in your laboratory completing your various surveys to measure the development of purpose. But as a researcher, you are intentionally agnostic as to the nature of the purpose that these two individuals are telling you they've cultivated. And so from a scientific perspective, that kind of makes sense because science doesn't have a framework to say this is a good purpose, this is a bad purpose. We can say people who strive for this kind of thing have these kinds of outcomes, but that really just pushes the kind of fundamental question back one. Are those outcomes good? Well, those outcomes are associated with these other outcomes. And it's just kind of infinite regress. Because science on its own can't provide this sense of, and this is good. And when we want to talk about purpose and telos, we're talking about striving towards something according to our purpose. And this is where I really think that some of the best research is actually coming out of Christian laboratories where they'll say, this is as far as the science gets us. And then we can think about and go beyond that, moving into the realm of theological inquiry. And so it's not to say that there's no boundary between theological inquiry and psychological science, but rather when we bring the two together, we have a wider lens of the landscape where we can say, look, these choices are associated with these outcomes from science, and we think these outcomes are in line with God's calling on our life or not, right? And so we actually have another framework within which to assess that. And in the paper, I cited Pam King in this book that she's co-authored talking about the developmental dilemma. And I think Pam King is a great example of a psychologist who's also a theologian doing a lot of work around thriving and telos, drawing both from theological insights and from psychological science.
Thanks, Erin. I get lost in your answer. My mind is just racing on this. It's such a fruitful and interesting conversation because it really is this continuing. Dale, your question got right at the continuing question in the ASA. We're always dealing with this, and knowing, which hat do we have on, at the moment and what's appropriate. I'm just reminded that you were finishing. We're in this wonderfully postmodern moment where there is no big story and you can't point to, and that is reflected right back into the work that we do. Mm-hmm. We're going to turn now to another questioner, Robert Mann. Robert, you go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes. Hi, Erin. Thanks. I read the article yesterday in preparation for the meeting. It's not my area of expertise, but I did think it was very interesting. So I guess from the article and what you said, there's this trend to view the self as primary instead of epiphenomenal in neuroscience. So I'm wondering if that is right or if that's still a minority opinion. And if the self is epiphenomenal, I have never understood how to make sense of that. So those would be my questions.
Yeah, such good questions. And I will say that I think that your question hits on a tension that I don't address well because it's something I'm still trying to sort out, which is where is the tipping point in the broader field of neuroscience relative to this question. And so I think that there is, at minimum, kind of a sizable minority of folks who want to flip the script and make the self fundamental. But even in that, there are individuals who might agree with that perspective, but disagree as to how Northoff himself has done that in this theory. I think that the majority of neuroscience work is probably still treating the self as epiphenomenal, not engaging with kind of the deeper philosophical inquiries that say, well, we really need to deal with what does that mean, right? And so you have some who are intentionally, and actually Northoff and some of the folks that he's co-authored these articles with, they intentionally engage Daniel Dennett and say, no, this is bad philosophy and it's not supported by the science. And so I do think that we see both arguments within neuroscience, but also arguments between neuroscience and philosophy, which for me is actually really exciting And that's part of the reason why I wanted to write this paper, not because it's the period in the sentence, but because I was hoping to draw together what I could understand about this article right now, so that we can see how do these various and in many ways kind of bifurcated arguments between different camps in neuroscience and different camps of neuroscience and philosophy, how are these going to play out? And what is the role of both data and data interpretation of adjudicating between these different possibilities? I just think that there's a lot of kind of potential that can come out of this. That was the first part of your question, but now I've forgotten the second part.
Well, the other is, I mean, how can the self be epiphenomenal? It just doesn't make any sense to me, given its role in volition, in interpretation, and all that kind of thing. My personal impression is that people like it primarily because they're in love with reductionism, and that would make it follow. But maybe I'm missing something here.
No, thank you for that. I think that it is, if you want to include the idea of self as related to will and volition and agency, then it can't be purely epiphenomenal. But there are quite a few neuroscientists who have no problem with jettisoning the ideas of will, volition, and agency. And so if you're willing to get rid of those, which I think are the more complicated ones to get rid of, then why bother maintain this separate idea of a self? The self is just kind of the collection of neural circuits that then we interpret post hoc as being something we might call me. But they would argue that all of those are incidental in the same way that my beliefs that I'm the one choosing to be here and producing these words, that's also an illusion. And so it's kind of this package deal that can go together, that when you're willing to get rid of ideas of agency, you can just kind of package up the self with it as well. I also agree that that's not convincing to me. And I think that there are good reasons out of both philosophy and science to question the agency, that we have no agency question. I think we have a lot less agency than intuitively we think we do, but that doesn't mean we have none. And when we think about top-down influences, and even there's all sorts of criticisms. I don't know if you know of the Benjamin Libet experiment, measuring free will. There's all sorts of
the delay. That's the neural delay or something, right?
Yes, that we have a neural signal before we have a thought of intention to do something. And so he argued that that's because our consciousness is after the brain response. There's all sorts of criticisms to that, but he interpreted this as ideas that we have free won't, that we have override. That is still a form of agency, right? That who is doing the overriding? Even if it's a long-term goal, there is still something that for me, I want to hold on to and talk about as self. Yeah. But this is a really complicated question. And I remember in the working group with the theologians and philosophers who kind of kicked off this whole inquiry for me, I remember one of them asking me, so how do psychologists define a self or define a person? That's the word that they use. And I said, they don't. We don't use that word. We don't use the word person or personhood. We talk about self-identity. We talk about moral identity. And we break up this idea of self into 100 different concepts, none of which kind of seem to have their finger on the pulse of our intuitive sense of I am a whole individual. And I do think some of this is kind of a byproduct of the history of how we got to these questions. And I'm hoping that sometime in the future, I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, if we can reorganize and have a paradigm shift, we might be able to bring these disparate ideas together. And maybe I'm a bit optimistic, but I think that if we are going to do that, that Christians are going to be part of that process because we bring with us different epistemological tools than science on its own can.
Okay, there's a lot of other comments, but I'd love to talk to you for a couple of hours, but there are other people waiting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Very interesting question. And when that paper comes in, I'd like to see it submitted to Jim in the journal so we can get it Marika, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much. Being the third person here, I'm already off in 5 other different tangents here. I really appreciate, Erin, your introduction in situating the questions you're dealing with in the history of psychology, because I have no history with psychology whatsoever. And my introduction to psychology that I have found of any use in personal and interpersonal relationships and in religion, shall we say, I'm not even going to go so far as to say theology or philosophy. I started with neuroscience, right? And particularly neuroscience in the past couple of years in fMRI things. And I found it very useful. So I'm not sure I'm going to be even using vocabulary in any way that anyone else does. Where I do come to this subject is from a background in artificial intelligence, in ecosystem management, in climate science, all areas where the history of our science has been increasingly incorporating more and more and more important variables about which we know a certain amount, but I don't think most of us in this field think we have the slightest idea that there ever will be an end to the important variables we're going to have to incorporate. And the overarching idea is the idea of complex systems. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that in this discussion group, I have gotten into some misunderstandings with philosophers who define complexity as almost the opposite of what I'm defining complexity. And they're looking for simplicity. I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm looking to incorporate more and more and more with no end in sight, mm-hmm. even theoretically. So that I have found myself in a scientific end going increasingly towards a completely non-deterministic science that has an open teleology, mm-hmm. which I find is wonderful for my theology, because there's all sorts of things that can provide that. But by a complex system, something which has always got more to be considered and whose current phenomena have to do with interactions among the various variables, each of which has its own way of being, whether that involves a little bit of freedom, like an atom aligning itself with this molecule rather than that molecule, or whether we're talking about human free will or divine, I don't even know what the word to use here is. And I find that when people start talking about deterministic and non-deterministic science, the way I'm reading through them, what I'm hearing is they're really determinists, but they just think if only we had a little more data and a little bit better algorithms, mm-hmm. then we could predict the future. I don't think that. And in that context, the idea of self or identity as an emergent phenomena, I won't say an epiphenomena, but an emergent phenomena, which has its own integrity and its own relationship to God, if you will, seems to make sense. Now, I probably have not made any sense whatsoever. I'm not sure I have to myself even here. But since this is that kind of a discussion, I'm delighted to throw it out and see if you have any feedback on that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So as you were talking, I made a couple of notes. And this is where I think it's so interesting. You talked about kind of a science with an open teleology, but I think we can even within the same science, there's an interpretation as to whether we are talking about purpose and intention or just a lack of predictability. So I teach cognitive psychology to undergrads at California Baptist University. And one of the things that I ask them to do is we read this book by a neuroscientist who essentially argues that neuroscience has demonstrated that free will doesn't exist. So we ought to revise our entire criminal justice system because there's no such thing as blameworthiness. And then I have them read some counter chapters, both by Christians and by non-Christian neuroscientists who take basically the exact same data and come to a different conclusion about the nature of responsibility. And I just ask them to grapple. And then I give them a 5-minute presentation. I'm like, just answer all the questions in 5 minutes. It's really an impossible assignment, but that's part of the point. And one of the things that I think about when you look at this set of data and you want to draw a particular kind of interpretation, whether it's just that these data imply in their complexity a certain lack of predictability. So the neuroscientist who I have them read the book, who makes the no free will argument, he suggests that we'll never be able to fully predict and explain human behavior. But he also says that doesn't mean it's not constrained within this within the complex system that makes it essentially determined at kind of the most fundamental level. But you could look at that exact same data and say, well, actually, that lack of predictability, that openness that is generated by the complexity of the system, that's where there is opportunity for agency and teleology. Yes. But asking that question is outside the scope of what we have available to us with the tools of science. The kind of determinism, non-determinism falls on that exact same spectrum, I think.
It's as far as trying to figure this out, now that I'm retired and I don't have to make my living being a scientist anymore. I find I look in areas like saying there are answers. As a matter of fact, there are many right answers. There are also many wrong answers, depending upon the question you ask. And they're really, while I by faith, I would say there is an answer, but I'm never going to get to it. Yeah. And I'm not sure any of creation is going to get to it. And so I find this intersecting with incarnation theology, the nature of personhood. And personhood is a legal and literary term as well as a psychological term. So I'm finding myself nibbling at edges there. But I very much like what you said. There's no good answers. There's only better questions. Yeah. But I'm going to try to be very certain that the question we ask is a better question and not a sneaky way of recycling questions that we already know we can't answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I just think we, as Christian scientists, we often are kind of mindful of the admonition about God of the gaps, right? We don't want a God of the gaps because eventually science might chip away at that domain. And then where does God end up in that? And so I think that we need to be very careful not to restrict the activity of God to the things we don't know. And I think that we ought to also have our eyes open to the possibility of the opposite, of having a science of the gaps, where we say, well, we don't know this yet, but we've, just give us time, maybe, but also maybe not. And so I guess I'm saying that I think we need to be really careful about even how we describe that, because I'm a scientific optimist. I think that we are going to be able to explain a whole lot over the course of kind of however long we have in this world for scientific inquiry. But at the same time, I also have to hold open in my palm, if you will, that there's a possibility that there are questions that could be within the realm of scientific inquiry that we might never know the answer to. And that also is okay. Right. That doesn't mean we can't get a whole lot closer and develop deeper understanding.
I definitely agree with you there. I find myself when confronting the God of the gaps idea, when a gap gets filled, or at least potentially filled, my tendency is not to say, oh, well, that's one less that God doesn't do, but rather, that's how God did it. Doggone. Aren't we lucky we get to find that out?
That's a very good summary and a nice way to transition. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Joseph. Joseph, you've got your hand raised. You can unmute and ask your question. We'll keep this discussion moving.
Hi, Erin.
Hi there.
A few minutes ago, you used the phrase "a Christian laboratory." And I'm curious what you meant by that and whether such a thing is even possible.
Well, that's a good question. Did I use that phrase? You're telling me I did, so I must have. So another little tirade down kind of the history of psychology is there are different camps in psychological science. A lot of this is around counseling and clinical work as to whether it is appropriate to engage what we might call mainstream secular, say, therapeutic interventions founded on particular naturalistic assumptions, whether that's appropriate, or if we actually need to start with scripture and then build out a kind of an epistemology of psychology from there and use that, because where we start at least influences, if not determines, depending on your kind of philosophical camp, where we start is going to influence where we end up in terms of the questions that we ask. And so there are individuals in psychology who will argue that there is a distinctly Christian psychology. Sometimes its findings are going to overlap with secular psychology, but other times they're not, because we have different starting points, we have different assumptions built into how the world works. We're going to have different conclusions. So there's the kind of the Christian psychology, and then there's integrationist psychology, which I would fall more in this camp, arguing that we actually can take psychology as it were and do psychology in any location according to the norms of our scientific discourse community, and we will be able to generate knowledge. And that as a Christian, I can add this in, if you will, to ask different questions, to probe answers differently, and even to interpret the data that I get from a different perspective. But this is not like a parallel universe of psychology. It is an integration of different ways of knowing, both from psychological science and from theology. And so if I use the phrase Christian laboratory, I was probably trying to talk about this idea of Christians doing psychological science, and bringing their Christian identities and beliefs to bear on their understanding and their interpretation in both an implicit and an explicit way. I was not trying to refer to this kind of parallel start with scriptural epistemology and then build out science from there. Did I answer the question that you were asking, or did I raise another one? Feel free to follow up.
Well, one's interpretation of scripture sometimes leads to erroneous science.
Yeah. Well, and so this is one of my big critiques with the kind of Christian science, I don't want to say, I'll say Christian psychology movement, is that I think there is an assumption, and I know some individuals in this camp, and they don't necessarily kind of see it the way I see it, and there is more humility than what I'm about to say. So I'm not trying to make an unnecessary generalization here, but sometimes there is an assumption that if we start with scripture, our scriptural understanding is kind of de facto correct. And I'm not sure that we should have that strong of an approach where we want to build a whole epistemology of science off of what I understand to be a mediated understanding of scripture that also happens in community according to conventions of theological inquiry. And so I think that we will have more robust knowledge if we take theology as theology is practiced and psychology as psychology is practiced and ask where they are mutually enriching.
Thank you.
Very, very helpful, Erin. I was reminded of your first talk in System 1 and System 2 thinking, the kind of how we sort of, it sounds like you kind of easily move from a critical stance to just a very quick, rapid kind of, and that can get us into trouble. All right, Sai, you have had your hand raised for a bit.
Hi, Erin. I really enjoyed the paper and your talk. I want to get back, if we may, to this whole issue of agency and free will and what is the self and the rest of it. And it's very interesting to me what you were describing, because I'm a biochemist, and I mostly, at this point, I'm interested in theoretical biology and how biochemistry interacts with evolution, things of that, very biological stuff. And what I have found in biology is a very widespread and, to me, disturbing kind of, I guess I could call it a dogma, which is that reductionism is key and certain things must be eliminated from the field of biology to keep it scientific. And that means that biology is often considered to simply follow laws of chemistry and physics. There's even some denial that any other kinds of biological laws exist. And I understand that you talked about the history of psychology, and the history of biology was it started as a branch of metaphysics because nobody knew anything. And there's still, I believe, a sort of a defensive reaction to make sure that we never talk about purpose in biology. That's completely forbidden. We don't talk, even some people won't want to talk about agency, which even someone like Daniel Dennett has said is ridiculous, because clearly animals and living organisms have agency and have purpose. But we're not supposed to talk about it. And what I heard you say about the field of psychology sounds very familiar to me there. And especially when we look at things like the self, actually your whole paper, and we look at things like, is there free will and is there agency of the mind, et cetera. And I think in both cases, in both the case of psychology and in biology, we're not going to make much progress scientifically. And I'm not bringing in theology yet. I'm just saying that scientifically, there are questions that we're not going to answer unless we expand the scientific tools that we have. And to me, agency is a scientific tool. I mean, if somebody wants to do something, they do it, or maybe they don't do it. And that's where, you have to apply methods, which I certainly don't know anything about, of analysis to determine what the role of agency is. And you have to admit that agency exists. So when I hear people like some of the people you've described, and I don't remember their names, who say, there's no such thing as free will, everything is deterministic. To me, that's an echo of when I hear people say there's no purpose in evolution, there's no purpose in biology. Yeah, you can keep saying that, but we're not going to get anywhere that way. We're not going to understand I believe that we're not going to understand some of the basic, in my case, the basic questions that haunt biologists. How did life begin, for example? But I'm not going to get into that. My question to you is, do you think that this mania for reductionism actually, which is what I think, so I'm wondering whether you agree, is actually a religious view? And the religious view is a anti-religious view. In other words, it's an atheistic view, which is we cannot admit to the existence of agency or teleology. We cannot admit to anything other than reductionism without opening the door to God, and that door has to remain firmly shut.
Yeah, such a rich kind of context and question. And I have, like all of you, I have several different thoughts. So one in my background, I've studied religious cognition, and one of the questions that folks who study religion from a psychological perspective, one of the questions that plagues us is, what is a religion? What is a religious belief? What is a religious action? And how do you draw the boundaries around understanding something as religious or not religious? Because as soon as you think you have a good definition, you have an example which everyone thinks is religious that doesn't fit it. And so it's one of these boundaries with fuzzy borders. And so in that, I think your comment about kind of reductionism almost as religious, I actually think it kind of fits in that boundary. There is an experimental psychologist named Miguel Farias in the UK who has a couple of papers on scientism and belief in science, but not belief about science, belief in science. This idea that we are, and so now I'm going beyond what his papers will say. We are made as liturgical beings. We are made as worshiping beings. And so if you want to take God out of that, that doesn't somehow change the nature of who we are. And so we see this in individuals, like what his research will say, turning to science essentially as a belief system, not just a way that fleshes out our knowing of how the world works that we then bring a meta-narrative into, but actually as the meta-narrative in and of itself, as a way in which we can probe and understand and make sense of the world. We see this also, and this is not a research statement, but in individuals who will turn to extreme dieting or exercise routines as a way of saying, actually, there are certain rituals and habits that are built into, for me as a Christian, I would say built into how we have been created to be, that when devoid of these structures, we find other ways of fulfilling. And so I do actually think you're onto something there. And if you look back to like Thomas Nagel is a philosopher. He wrote in the 70s the paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he talks about qualia and these kinds of things, talking about the subjective experience. He was a well-respected philosopher until I think it was 2005. He wrote this book, Mind and Cosmos, where he argues that Darwinian evolution kind of without, like on its own at this pure reductionist level is most certainly wrong. And he wrote this as an atheist who doesn't believe that Christianity or any other religious belief system can fill the gap, but he still thinks that Darwinian evolution is wrong. He got raked across the coals for that because ultimately he argues for some kind of panpsychism, right? This kind of like presence in all. But if you look at modern philosophy now, however many years later, they've kind of come full circle. You either have kind of a religious philosophical interpretation, or you have something like what Nagel offered, and you have something like panpsychism getting back into the mainstream because we don't have ways of answering the questions that you're highlighting here in a way that's faithful to kind of what the science can do. And I think that people are realizing we actually do need something to fill that gap, and we just don't know what that is, and we don't like the Christian version. So I do think that you're onto something there. And my kind of trying to keep my finger on the pulse of these different domains has suggested that there is something happening to that regard. If I might say one other thing out of developmental psychology, which is really where my training is, there is some fascinating research that looks at what do children believe. And there's a really interesting reason to ask what children believe about certain things, because if you go young enough, you can say they only have limited cultural impact. And so you can start to ask questions about what are our cognitive structures like that makes us more readily able to think about the world in certain kinds of ways. And then we can ask the question, and do we see those ways of thinking at early ages across cultures? And so something like teleological reasoning. There's a psychologist at Boston University who published a paper in the early 2000s where she introduced the phrase promiscuous teleology. And she argues that young children are promiscuous in their use of teleological explanation. So you ask a school-age child, why is this rock pointy? And you give them two options. Well, because natural forces, wind, water, right? That's how the rock was shaped by those forces. Or you give them an option like, well, it's pointy so that birds can sit on it and bears can scratch their backs. And they're going to choose the teleological explanation. Yeah. It's more satisfying to them intuitively. And so I think about, we have these kind of cognitive structures that make us want to engage in the world in a certain way. And I think about common sense philosophy, like Thomas Reid in the Scottish 1800s. He says, look, if we all think about the world in a certain way, there's a good reason to kind of wonder if that might be true until it's been demonstrated not to be.
Right.
And so I do think there is something there as well. But again, that's a philosophical interpretation. Why do we have this kind of promiscuous teleology? Might it tell us something about purpose and design in the world? Not kind of like in a mutually exclusive way to those other naturalistic ways, but might it tell us something fundamental about the organization of the world and our place in it? Maybe.
Yeah, that's great. And just very quickly about this question of the God of the gaps, I really like what you said, and I agree that what we should be doing is not putting God into gaps of knowledge, but we should be thinking only about what we do know. And there's plenty of what we do know that justifies belief in God. We don't have to go to gaps. But I also like what you said about science of the gaps. And what I'm concerned about is that if we are not brave enough or willing enough to expand our scientific tools into areas that are now forbidden, we're not going to make any progress. And, if we look at what happened in physics, and physicists here may correct me because I'm not a physicist, but when we look at what happened in physics, the pioneers of relativity and quantum theory had to use new approaches. They couldn't use the physics of the 19th century to discover what was going on with light and electrons. And I think that's true in biology, and I think it's true in psychology. We're going to have to be a little brave.
That's a great question, Si, and a great response, Erin. That's, again, quintessential ASA. We start with psychology and neuroscience, and all of a sudden we're out to not only biology, the origin of life, but cosmology. We've got it all, lots of links there. So as you and Erin were interacting, I was thinking in two directions. One, the notion of panspermia. How are we going to get life on this planet? I think it was Crick that went to panspermia and said, well, it must have been seeded from space somewhere. It's just too complex. And the other side is a contemporary one. Erin, as you're talking about these things, where do religious ideas, where do they come from? That is the whole realm of big gods theory at the moment, and trying to understand where does this all arise. So these are very lively questions that are out there. We're going to draw this to a close. I've got Bob Geddes has been waiting patiently to get a question in here, and we're going to ask Bob to unmute and do that. And then we'll see if we can draw this together. Bob?
Okay, thank you. I hope I'm coming over okay, because my our internet up here at the cottage is not great. But thank you very much, Erin, for today and for your article. This past February, at the end of the month, the Waterloo chapter of the CSCA and ASA, as part of the 50th anniversary speakers series, had Dr. Gary Partlow, a biologist from the University of Guelph, give his talk and his perspective on his life as a researching scientist and as a Christian. And he concluded by saying, to help us with this, the interaction between the two, that we, as a society, have learned to really focus on thinking Greek, as he would put it, and we have to learn to get back to also thinking Hebrew. And so kind of the rational thinking versus the thinking that accepts what we don't know and focuses on the mysterious. And as I was reading through your article, that kept going through my mind. And then some of the things you were saying today, that kept going through my mind. And then John adding just at the end here about how do we bring the religious aspect into all of this thinking. Do you see some value, or I find it very useful, but can you see how this relates to what you are writing about and saying in terms of the sort of the two ways of thinking that you have been talking about and the influences on that? Is there some advantage to, and would you agree that maybe we have to develop a way of thinking more Hebrew, and in that way bringing the religious side back into the focus on what we are discussing here?
That's a great question. I have not heard the distinction put in that way, thinking Greek versus thinking Hebrew. So I appreciate that. So as a scientist, I think that it is really important, and I feel like this is something I actively work to do better, but to more clearly articulate what it is I don't know and where the boundaries of my knowing relative to scientific inquiry are, because it's really easy to drift out of that expertise into other areas and assert the same kind of confidence and the same kind of expertise that I don't actually have in those. So I work really hard to try to articulate and kind of settle in my own mind, partly as an act of humility, where are the boundaries of my knowledge. And so the more I do that, the more I realize how little I know relative to how much I don't know and understand. And so I'm actually saying this at a personal level, but I think that's true if we were to zoom up and look at, say, the body of knowledge in science. There is a lot that we know, but there is a whole lot more that we don't know, questions that we don't even yet have to ask because they're so far from our knowing. And so in that sense, I think it's really important that we do that exercise. And so to develop this capacity to be comfortable in that unknowing, I think is a really important part of doing science well, because science also says it's partly our job to push that boundary of our knowing. So to kind of not just say, oh, I don't know. Okay, that's the end of the inquiry. I don't think that's the calling, but to say, I'm actually going to try to push the boundaries of my knowing, recognizing my finitude, recognizing my limits, the limits of science, and saying that even as I chip away at what I don't know, that I can be comfortable in that unknowing. And that I can say there, and this is where, again, the meta-narrative really comes in, that for me as a Christian, I will say God has given me this playground of his natural world to explore for the glory of his name. And at the end of the day, I'm kind of at the end of my life, there are things that I might never know. And that's okay, because it's still within the context of God's playground and I know who God is. And so I think that there is it's a little bit of this both and when it comes to trying to cultivate the spirit of thinking Hebrew, that we want to not use that as a way of escaping engagement with knowledge, which I don't think is consistent with a thinking Hebrew perspective. But we also want to develop kind of a comfort in the unknown while also working to push our knowledge in that unknowing with a sense of humility. That's kind of how I would think about those categories anyways.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I mean, just from what you are saying now, I'm reminded of what kind of lies behind a lot of the Psalms. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. And I can once again, that talk I referred to was really put together majorly by Robert Mann. So I'm just glad to see him here as well.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks, Bob, for that great question. And that reminds me of a professor that once made that distinction between Greek thinking and Hebrew thinking. And the Hebrews kind of just walk around, like walking around a campfire, looking at all different directions, say, isn't that interesting? Yes. And that's
I'll also, if I can, just real quick, make a plug. A friend of mine who's an Old Testament scholar published a book. It's an academic monograph called Biblical Epistemology, and he basically makes an argument that scientific thinking is kind of the origins of what we understand as a scientific epistemology has its origins in Hebraic thought. In the Old Testament. And I find his work to be very interesting. His name is Drew Johnson. So just put that plug out there for those who are interested in that particular question.
Very good. Thank you. You've reminded us, and right here at the end, reminded us that we need to stimulate these conversations between the disciplines, and reminded us again that theology is a very important piece and can really help us when asking these deeper questions. Remind ourselves that is quintessential ASA. We are a scholarly and professional society. We're also a community that supports one another and loves one another. And this is a way to love each other with our minds. It's a lot of work. Erin, you've done a lot of work. We want to thank you for that. And now, if you have any final words that you want to give us about this paper, or have you summed it up now? No
words about the paper, except that one of the things this conversation is driving me. I wrote it down. I'm going to keep thinking about this, is the role of parsimony in thinking about our scientific explanations, and also what this, even thinking about Sai's question about this resistance to reductionism, often going to, or individuals going to great lengths to try to find a naturalistic explanation when there might be a much more parsimonious theological explanation for that same idea within a broader context. So that's something that I'm going to walk away from this kind of continuing to chew on as I now have those wheels turning. So I would just like to thank all of you for being here and for engaging in this work. I find that a great note of respect, and I would welcome hearing from any of you additional thoughts.
Well, thank you for that. It's been our pleasure, Erin, to have you here and to be able to dive deeper into this good work that you have been doing, and we certainly appreciate it. We invite you back for another Diving Deeper next month, and we'll have a stimulating conversation on perspectives in science and Christian faith. So with that, I wish you all a happy Easter, for we know that Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. Have a great day.